Welcome, everybody. I'm Rami Khouri from AUB, Professor of Journalism, and helping to coordinate this new initiative which we've successfully launched. And this is the fifth AUB in New York City briefing that we have. The aim of this program is to bring AUB faculty from Beirut to the US, partner with faculty members here in the US, and have a seminar discussion for an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, and discuss issues of mutual interest, all based on research that we've done in Beirut and that professors here have done, so that we can share knowledge and share analysis and develop greater interactions between AUB and many institutions here in the US. So we're very grateful for all of the work that has been done here at the AUB New York office, Ada Porter and her staff, and Alice Freeman, who oversees the project here, and all of the other staff who have worked very hard on this. And thank you to the people in Beirut, Joseph Azel and his crew over there. Today we're doing something a bit unusual, which is having a briefing which comprises 4 professors, 2 from AUB and 2 from the Boston Consortium for Arab Region Studies, otherwise known as BCARS. And BCARS is a consortium that was set up a couple of years ago with 5 universities in the Boston area, and AUB and AUC and other partners in the region being involved to, again, bring together research professors from the Middle East, Arab world, from the Boston area to share knowledge and share notes. And the process has been moving well, and this is the first time we do this kind of briefing where we have an event in New York here today, and Monday we're going to do a similar event in Boston at Harvard University in Cambridge with the same 4 speakers but with a different group of participants. And this is the beginning of a process by which we expand this AUB New York City briefings to different parts of the country. And the next stage is to do this all over the world, in Europe and the Arab world, and the East and Africa. So I want to thank all the people who've made this possible. Thank you all for coming today, and greetings to everybody in Beirut, Carmen and the gang. Thank you for all being there. And we will start with a set of presentations here by the 4 professors. We'll start here, and then we'll...
I think they're having a problem.
They don't hear us?
Yeah, there's sound. Yeah, going through the phone. So, can you hear us at all in Beirut?
Can you hear us in Beirut? No?
We can hear you. It's just not. We can hear you. It's just not very clear.
Okay. Let's see what the tech guys can figure out. Let's just wait a minute and see if they come up with a solution. Otherwise, we'll start and then we'll figure it out as we go along. So let me just say a couple more comments on BCARS. This was an initiative that we were at AUB were involved in partnering with the folks in Boston. Dennis Sullivan, Professor Sullivan at Northeastern University, heads the whole process. He initiated it, and it's brought together people from faculty from 5 different universities who have all been doing research on different aspects of the Middle East. Is it working?
If we could speak up a little bit, because they're having a hard time hearing us.
All right. So I'll try to raise my voice a bit, and then maybe we can move the speaker into the middle or something. So the thing that brings together BCARS with our interest at AUB is to generate and share knowledge about the Middle East and the Arab world that's done through research, to provide an alternative to what we hear on the media and in other places in the public sphere, which is mostly analysis and commentary, which is often not based on facts, often not based on real knowledge that comes from research, and we try to counter that with what we do and what BCARS and many of our colleagues all over the United States do who do serious research. So this is a process that we are happy to be involved with. And today we have 4 speakers who are going to speak about different aspects of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Jordan and on their way to Europe in many cases. We'll start with Dr. Reem Saab, who is an assistant professor of social psychology at AUB, who has done research on Syrian refugees and their relations with Lebanese host communities. And then we'll go to Sausan Abdurrahim. Sausan is an associate professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at AUB, and she has done research for some years on different aspects of Palestinian and Syrian refugees, especially women's health conditions and related issues. Then we will go to Alicia Berticelli, who is a scholar at a PhD candidate at Northeastern University, who has worked on the condition and issues related to Syrian refugees as they try to migrate or seek refuge in Europe. And then finally we'll have Dennis Sullivan, who is going to talk about research that he's been involved with for several years on the issue of the Jordan model of providing work permits for Syrian refugees in Jordan, and whether that's working out or not, and what's going on there. So we'll start with Reem. Reem. I think that's fine. Just raise your voice if you could. As much as you can.
So good morning to everyone here in New York, and good afternoon to those of you following us in Beirut. I would first like to thank Rami Khouri for inviting me and the AUB New York office for organizing this. So in Lebanon we have about 1.5 million Syrian refugees. Now about 3/4 of those are estimated to be living under the poverty line, so that's under $4 a day. The stereotypical image of the Syrian refugee in the media is that of someone living in a tented settlement, but actually in Lebanon, about 80% of the Syrian refugees are estimated to be living side by side with host communities. Now, many of them live in abandoned buildings, in garages, sheds, so basically in inadequate shelters, and many of them in really overcrowded conditions. Now, prior to the refugee crisis, Lebanon had about 4 million inhabitants, and about 1/4 of Lebanese were themselves living below the poverty line. 2 of the most marginalized areas in Lebanon are the north of Lebanon, so the Akkar region, which is bordering Syria, and the Beqaa region, which is to the east of the country and also borders Syria. And it is exactly in these areas that the vast majority of Syrian refugees have settled. Just to give you also a little bit of background about the profile of the Syrians that have come, many of them, most of them only have a basic education, and most of them are unskilled workers. Whereas the Lebanese tend to have a slightly higher education profile in those areas. So unsurprisingly, there have been growing tensions between the 2 communities. Just last month, the Human Rights Watch reported that over 3,000 Syrian refugees got forcibly evicted, and about 40,000 remain at risk of eviction. So by 2014, there were already about 1 million Syrian refugees in the country. International NGOs are really concerned about tracking social cohesion and maintaining stability in the country. So they started to inject funds to try and track social cohesion. And around that time, my colleague, Professor Charles Harib at AUB, approached me. He's also a social psychologist at AUB. So he approached me to join him on a project with Save the Children, the international NGO, to try and assess social cohesion between Lebanese nationals and Syrian refugees in the most vulnerable areas in the Beqaa and Akkar. So together we conducted one of the earliest studies on social cohesion in these areas. We learned a lot about the level and the kinds of social tensions that exist there, but also the underlying causes. So this is what I will be sharing with you today. Now, let me say that the data dates back from 2014, but actually more recent figures show that the same problems are there, so the data remains valid to this day. In terms of methodology, of course, we were trying to study social cohesion, so it made sense to look at the Lebanese perspective and also the Syrian perspective. So we began with interviews with Lebanese municipality leaders in Beirut and Akkar in various locations. We then conducted focus groups with both Syrians and Lebanese. And then we followed these up with a survey of a representative sample of about 600 Lebanese and 600 Syrians. So let's look at what the picture looks like in the eyes of the Lebanese according to our findings. The Syrian refugee crisis is experienced as one that has caused a severe economic strain on Lebanon. Now, a major source of tension is competition over jobs. The Lebanese complain about increases in unemployment, increases in the prices of rents, goods, and services. They blame the Syrians for unfair competition, saying the Syrians are receiving humanitarian aid and they can afford to work for lower wages. So they're bringing wages down and they're driving the Lebanese out of their jobs. In our study, we found that over 90% of the Lebanese feel that their livelihoods are threatened by the Syrians. There's also a perception that the Syrians are abusing the aid system, so they're claiming multiple benefits from different aid organizations, from different municipalities. And there's a suspicion towards the intention of Syrian refugees, with some saying they're not really here because they're running away from persecution and are afraid for their safety. They're really there and staying there because of personal economic gains. Now, the reason why it's important to study these perceptions of threat is because, of course, they can translate to negative attitudes and hostility towards those deemed responsible. So we find in our study that Lebanese that feel a greater sense of threat also hold more negative attitudes towards the local municipality leaders. There's also growing anger towards Lebanese property and business owners because they are seen to be the primary beneficiaries from the crisis. They have access to cheap labor and they're charging highly inflated rents for really shabby accommodations. So unsurprisingly, within this context, we find that about half of the Lebanese view merchants and business owners as significantly corrupt. Another source of tension is the reduced provision of basic public services. Municipality leaders that we spoke to complained about the strange infrastructure and drained resources due to the surge in population. So there's a breakdown in sewage networks, national electricity, waste management resources, and water supplies. A fear that these services are severely strained. And recent figures across the country basically show only 8% of municipalities across the country are able to provide all basic services to the inhabitants. Now, let's also not forget that many municipalities were struggling to provide these services prior to the refugee crisis. An important grievance among the Lebanese is this great sense of deprivation compared to the Syrian refugees. So they feel like the international NGOs are disproportionately assisting Syrian refugees in terms of food, clothes, fuel, healthcare, and so on, while the Lebanese are struggling to access some of these same goods and services. And even the local NGOs reduce the aid that they used to give to Lebanese, retargeting the aid towards Syrians. So in our study, we found that over 80% of Lebanese believe that Syrians in their town are getting a lot more financial support than the Lebanese. Another source of tension is the sense of dissimilarity in values and lifestyles. 95% of the Lebanese feel that their value system and ways of life are threatened by the Syrian refugees. Now, this might sound surprising because in those areas, 95% of the Syrians and the Lebanese are Muslim Sunnis. So they have a shared religion, they have a shared language, and even politically, most of them do not support the Syrian regime. On the other hand, it's not so surprising when we think that in various towns, the population size has doubled, and in some areas, the locals have become a minority. And so it's not surprising that they feel that their lifestyle is actually threatened. And an example of the differences in lifestyle and changes, for example, is one person told us 2 years ago we did not used to see beer cans on the street. Now we see many of those. And of course, alcohol consumption in these areas is frowned upon. These tend to be conservative areas. Alongside these perceptions of threat, there's a growing sense of unsafety and fear of criminality. Over 70% of the Lebanese report fears of potential physical attacks, or attacks on private or public property by the Syrians. This is despite the fact that at the time that we conducted this study, the municipality leaders did not note any increase in criminality in those areas. There's also fears about the safety of women. So over 3/4 of the Lebanese fear that Syrian refugees would harm women and their families. So if we take all these set numbers and figures together, we can see that perceptions of threat are alarmingly high in those areas. Now, these threat perceptions are fed, of course, by the difficult realities on the ground, but we must also not forget that they are fed by political rhetoric and media coverage. For example, when we talk about the negative economic effects of the refugee crisis on Lebanon, we tend to conflate what has happened due to the Syrian war itself, regardless of the influx of the refugees. Politicians and media tend to exaggerate the impact of the refugee crisis for political ends. So if we think of threats to livelihood and safety, and we contrast this with the fact that the majority of Syrian refugees are actually women and children, then of course there are questions that can get asked about how high how justified these threat perceptions are at that level. So that's not to deny the fact that there are really difficult conditions for Lebanese living in those areas. It's also important to note that some subgroups among the Lebanese are of course benefiting economically from the refugee crisis. So the international humanitarian aid, of course, is providing funds whereby the Syrian refugees end up being consumers of local products like food, services, and rent. Lebanese companies have greater access to cheap labor. So there are, of course, subgroups that are benefiting from this crisis. Now, regardless of how exaggerated these threat perceptions are, it's really important to track them because once they are formed, they have the capacity to translate into hostility against those deemed responsible. So we find in our study that Lebanese who feel threatened hold more negative attitudes towards local Lebanese political leaders, and this might explain, of course, the recent increase in negative rhetoric on refugees amongst the politicians, especially around election times. And more importantly, the threat perceptions can also translate into hostility against refugees. In terms of declared support for violence, in our study we found that about 2/3 of Lebanese say they do not support violence towards refugees at all, leaving about 30% that support violence to varying degrees. Now, there have been reports in these areas of threats of violence against Syrians, evictions, verbal abuse, physical violence, and destruction of property. But I would say the vast majority of tensions seem to be taking the form of widespread discrimination against Syrian refugees. So we find in our study that greater perceptions of threat are associated with greater support for discriminatory policies against refugees. And the support for discriminatory policies is alarmingly high. So over 90% of Lebanese support banning Syrians from any political activity and also imposing nightly curfews on them. Recent figures actually indicate that around the country, around 400 municipalities impose some kind of curfew on Syrian refugees, so restricting their freedom of movement. And in our study, we found that over 3/4 of Lebanese support banning Syrians from working. So this is what the picture for the Lebanese looks like. We'll now turn to what the picture looks like for the Syrians according to our findings. We administered a scale to measure the psychological well-being of Syrians using a life satisfaction scale. And alarmingly, we found that about 90% of Syrians have low to very low life satisfaction ratings. This is regardless of gender, regardless of income, and regardless of whether or not they are intended settlements. Recent estimates show that about 90% of Syrians are in debt and trying to cover expenses for food, healthcare, and so on, rent, and so on. In our study, we found about 2/3 of Syrians feel that their livelihoods are threatened by the Lebanese. They complain that they're unable to find work, and that when they do find work, they are facing exploitative labor conditions with very low wages, long working hours. Sometimes they don't get paid, sometimes they don't get paid on time, and so on. They also complain about discrimination by Lebanese stores themselves. So food stores will sometimes charge them higher prices for the same goods compared to the Lebanese. So unsurprisingly, about half of the Syrians that we surveyed rated merchants and business owners as being significantly corrupt. There's also great difficulties in terms of access to healthcare. So Syrians complain about discrimination, with pharmacies refusing to provide the medicine even when they sometimes have those medicine. Hospitals are charging them higher prices than what they would charge for Lebanese, and sometimes they refuse to admit them if they cannot pay the bill up front. So about half of the Syrian refugees view the healthcare system as significantly corrupt. There's also complaints about the aid organizations themselves. One problem is that 3/4 of those that are living outside the tented settlements think that the aid is going disproportionately to those that are living inside the tented settlements, while those that are living outside the tented settlements are the majority and they are really facing difficult conditions. There's also complaints about corruption among aid organizations. We heard Syrians saying there's very high wages for staff, there's an excessive number of new cars, there's biases in the allocation of aid, and so on. And over 1/4 of the Syrians rated the international NGOs as significantly corrupt, and only about half have positive attitudes towards the INGOs. Now, there's also a big problem regarding legal residence permits. There's difficulties in renewing or acquiring legal residence status. The current estimates show up to half or more do not have legal residency in Lebanon, around the country. This, of course, is problematic because it limits the movement of Syrian refugees, it limits their ability to find work, it limits their access to healthcare, and of course, at the same time, it means that there are increased threats of perception to safety among the host communities. In terms of threat to safety among the Syrians, we found in our survey that they tend to be relatively low compared to the Lebanese. But here it's important to note that for the Syrians, they are probably comparing their situation in Lebanon to the safety threats that they endured in Syria. And so, of course, it's not surprising that they will rate these as relatively low in Lebanon. But in our focus groups, we found that Syrians complain about physical and verbal harassment, saying their shelter security is quite fragile. There are a threat of eviction in various cases. There's reports about sexual exploitation of refugees for rent, increased cases of prostitution. For the Syrian men, they also complain that in some areas they are getting publicly humiliated. As they're walking with their wives or sisters, Lebanese men harass the women, and when the Syrian men try to stand up to them, they get beaten up. Now, despite all of this, in our study we found that there seems to be limited potential for collective action by the Syrians. Syrians would tell us in various places they do not have any chance to engage in political activism, and they're also scared of fighting back, they're scared of getting deported, they are scared of retributions by the Lebanese against women, against children, against their family members, basically. So, in concluding, I would like to say also that I don't think we can talk about social cohesion between Syrians and Lebanese without commenting on the larger structural obstacles in the refugee crisis. So, as of yet, there has been no political settlement to the Syrian war. The conditions for the safe and dignified return of the Syrian refugees are not there yet, prolonging the crisis. In the meantime, the neighboring countries are hosting millions of refugees, while the world's wealthiest and most powerful nations refuse to host more refugees. They are only hosting a minority, even though those countries sometimes are playing a direct role in the Syrian war. Instead, what the international response has been is to basically provide Lebanon with funds. But even the appeals for funds remain chronically and severely underfunded. It's also worth mentioning that the funds that are going to Lebanon are actually going to a country that officially ranks amongst the most corrupt in the world, with a sectarian political system that lacks transparency, lacks accountability. So, of course, this undermines the integrity and the effectiveness of the aid response. So within these conditions, I think it's impossible to see how the Lebanese and the Syrians can thrive in these areas. So instead, they are living in a more of a survival mode or a prolonged emergency mode, which is why it's imperative to start addressing the structural obstacles to the refugee crisis. And I'd like to finish with the words of a middle-aged Syrian man that spoke to me during the research in one of the focus groups, and I think his words capture some of the real suffering in these areas. He said to me, in Syria you die once, but here you die 1,000 times. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to the discussion with you.
Thank you, Reem. Before we go to Sausan, I just wanted to remind people who may be watching on YouTube or on the web that you can send in comments if you wish on the AUB YouTube channel, which is aub.edu.lb/live. That's the AUB YouTube channel if people want to watch and send us any comments. And we will turn now to Sausan Abdurrahim.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And again, thank you very much, Rami, for putting this event together. What I will talk about today is a little bit more specific in relationship to the health of Syrian refugee women in Lebanon. Reem's presentation, in fact, provided a really good background for me to start with the specific information that I'm going to present. What I do is I take on a political economy of health framework in trying to understand the health of Syrian refugee women in Lebanon, and to link their situation, their social situation and health and well-being in Lebanon in relationship to where they came from and what was happening in their lives before they became displaced and before they became refugees in Lebanon. So using a political economy of health framework provides basically a theory or a way of thinking for health researchers for trying to understand how structural conditions, economic, political, and social conditions that women lived in or lived through in Syria before they became displaced shape their life chances and also shape their ability to access resources and improve their health. In this case, the changes in the health status or reduced ability of women to access health services are outcomes of the political and social realities that they lived in the last few decades, before 2011. This framework then really emphasizes the importance of looking at the historical context and not thinking about what is happening to refugees right now in this moment in Lebanon. And finally, it acknowledges the importance of the important role of the state in shaping the life chances of individuals and the resources that they can access. So those of you who know a little bit about the history of Syria or the context in Syria before 2011 know that the Syrian regime has historically espoused a social welfare system which promised large-scale and state-sponsored education and health services. A big part of that, some argue, is to indoctrinate the population by providing them with these services, particularly educational services. However, despite this rhetoric, in fact, there has been a lot of studies and some data that showed that there has been vast regional inequalities in Syria, both in terms of access to education and in terms of access to health as well. And these inequalities have disproportionately affected both men and women. They have affected men and women, but particularly Syrian women who live in more peripheral and rural regions in Syria. Some of the regions that have actually came under the control of ISIS shortly after 2011. So the little economic growth that was achieved in Syria since the 1990s and 2000s was in fact offset by an increase in poverty rates in rural areas and rising unemployment, particularly among women. So a lot of women who have been employed in agriculture, for example, have become dislocated from work and became more and more dependent on them. We're not ready for the slides yet. I'm sorry if you can keep this tied up. Yeah. So when we think about the health of Syrian refugee women in Lebanon, it's important to think about their health before they became refugees and what was happening to them, and the health system that they lived in before becoming refugees. So, and there are vast differences between the Lebanese health system and the Syrian health system that women have to come to terms with and to adapt. The Lebanese health system is privatized and medicalized, and basically relies a lot more on secondary and tertiary services rather than on primary care. And the services are provided in mainly hospitals and medical institutions. The two health outcomes that I actually look at more closely are women's ability to give birth in a hospital, in a medical institution, and whether the baby is weighed at birth. These are two standard health services that are looked at in public health. In Lebanon, currently in public hospitals in Lebanon, the majority of the births are actually Syrian refugee births in some of the hospitals in Beirut or in the north. And the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees actually subsidizes these births at 75%. They pay maternal and neonatal health services and the cost of facility delivery through a private insurance system. So UNHCR pays a private insurance system company, and this company actually pays 75% of the cost of these births. UNHCR also covers family planning services, ultrasounds, and phone consultations, and any lab work that is needed. On the other hand, the Lebanese Ministry of Health, or the healthcare system, is complaining about the fact that even though UNHCR covers 75% of the cost, in fact, the Lebanese government is covering the 25%, and the international community is not contributing to the health coverage of Syrian refugees. So the first thing that I look at is to look at basically regional inequalities in women's access to these health services in Syria before they became displaced and moved into Lebanon. So now we can show you the map, please. So the analysis that I do is on data from 2006 and 2009, and that's the latest data that is available for Syria, actually. So in one of the papers, actually with a colleague, Qais Busma, what we do is we do basic descriptive epidemiological analysis, but we couch this analysis within the political economy of health framework. I also use a lot of the writings by Bassem Haddad, who wrote on transformations in Syria in the last 2 decades, and some reports that have been written on inequalities and youth unemployment and changes in political and economic conditions in Syria. So what the data we looked at shows is that overall access to maternal and neonatal health services have been overall, this is national figures, have been improving in Syria. I look at data from 2006 and 2009. So over the course of the 3 years, things have improved, and women, a larger number or proportion of women have been able to give birth in the hospital and, for the baby to be weighed at birth. On the other hand, what these maps show, these maps are only for 2009. What they show is that there is wide inequalities in the proportion of women who access these services. So the figure on the left, the map on the left shows the proportion of women who could deliver, who delivered at home and who did not have access to to giving birth at an institution. And the darker regions are the regions where a larger proportion of women deliver at home. What you can see here is that the regions Tartus and Latakia are light in color, meaning that women have more access to give birth in an institutional facility. And the regions that are darker, which are Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, Al-Hasaka, and Raqqa, and these are the regions that were controlled by ISIS early on after 2011, are the ones where women had the highest proportion of delivering at home, meaning that they didn't have access to giving birth at a medical institution. And also the map on the right shows the same trend, or the same thing happening for the baby being weighed immediately after birth. So what this shows is that Although there have been overall improvements in access to maternal and neonatal health services in Syria at the national level, the maps from 2009 show that there are stark inequalities, and comparing data from 2006 and 2009, we see that these inequalities have been widening. The work that I'm doing also looks at both Iraq and Syria, and the regional disparities in Syria are actually much more heightened compared to Iraq, which we thought was surprising. So then the next figure shows basically that a big part of the explanation for the regional inequalities in access to health services is explained by inequalities in women's access to education. So what I show in this figure is comparing the region that had the lightest color, which is Tartus on the map, in the maps that I showed, and then with three regions that had darker colors of, indicating lower access to health resources by women, which are Raqqa and Hasaka and Beirut. And what we see in this figure is that women's access to secondary education overall is very low in Syria in 2009, but it is much lower in Raqqa and Hasaka and Beirut compared to Latakia. The other thing is that the orange bars show the proportion of babies who are weighed at birth, and you see the stark differences between the three regions, the three peripheral regions compared to others. So this figure leads me to talk about another study that I'm currently conducting on early marriage among Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Syrian refugee adolescent girls. So I'm looking at birth outcomes of Syrian refugee women in Lebanon, and a part of my work also is focusing on adolescent girls and particularly early marriage before turning 18, before a girl turns age 18, and basically the reproductive health outcomes of these girls. So what we see here in this figure, and you don't see it for Tartus because early marriage in Tartus before 2011 was 0. I'm not sure how reliable, this the numbers are. This is from 2019, but you see that early marriage is actually relatively is up there in Raqqa and Hasaka and Beirut. We're looking before the Syrian crisis in 2009 in Syria, the whole region. So the issue of early marriage has been receiving a lot of attention in the media, and there have been a few reports on early marriage among Syrian refugees in both Lebanon and Jordan, and also in Turkey. And it is logical because in general, women's fertility or women's decisions related to reproduction, to marriage, are affected by war and conflict and displacement. In the case of early marriage, loss of economic livelihood and the breakdown of traditional communal ties basically reinforce women's dependency, make women feel more vulnerable to gender-based violence, and in these situations, women opt for marriage as a way, single women or young women opt for marriage as a way to feel secure or to feel protected. And in particular with displacement, as families displaced due to war come under increasing threat, economic threat and inability to provide for all members of the family, marriage for young girls is seen as a way out, basically to protect them and provide them with economic sustenance. And also in the case of Lebanon and other contexts as well, early marriage is talked about in the community as a way of protecting women from sexual harassment and the threat and the fear of rape in Lebanon, which in this case would ruin the girl's life. And early marriage is seen as a much better option than not having married at all, not marrying at all. So, as I mentioned, this issue is very salient in the media and in the discourse of international organizations, and the main argument is that due to poverty and feelings of insecurity, it is important to try to think about ways of mitigating early marriage and reducing it due to its negative reproductive health outcomes on both the reproductive health outcomes on the adolescent girl herself and the health outcomes on the children or the babies that she would bear. So in looking at early marriage among adolescent girls in Lebanon, it's important to think about the mothers and the intergenerational inheritance of disadvantage that these girls have, not only because of displacement and being refugee, but also because of everything that has been happening to their parents' generation in the past 20 and 30 years. And one of the things that we are looking at is the association between early marriage and parental human capital. The education of the mother, the education of the father, where the mother and the father came from, and the father's ability to work and to sustain the family, and the mother as well after displacement. So in the next figure, what I show, the next slide, what I show is some of the work that we're doing actually with my colleagues in the Faculty of Health Sciences, Dr. Justin Leon and what is it, where we did a prevalence, we did a survey in the summer of 2016 looking at the prevalence of early marriage among 15 to 17-year-old girls and the factors that associate with early marriage, factors in displacement in Lebanon and also factors, the characteristics of the family before they became displaced in Lebanon. What this shows is, and this is of course not representative of the Syrian population, this is data from the Beirut region, and it's basically the level of education of the mothers of the women, the girls or the women who married before age 18. And what you see here is that the majority of these mothers have less than elementary education or less. So what is happening in Lebanon, and this is something that Reem alluded to, is that the refugee population has experienced a distillation or a concentration of poor human capital and poverty and disadvantage. So when we talk about early marriage or girls' opportunities in general to stay in school and not to get married, one of the things that are important to keep in mind is that the girls are in a family context where the mothers and the fathers and the family itself have very little human capital, and unless some of these things are addressed, then working in reducing early marriage at the level of raising awareness with the girls or with their mothers is not going to be very effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. We'll now go to Dennis Sullivan, who will talk to us about research that he and his team on BCARS and Northeastern and other places have done in Syria over the last, in Jordan over the last few years.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you everyone for partnering with BCARS for the last 5 years and counting since Rami helped me launch this amazing consortium. It's amazing because of the people we've brought together and we've been able to network together. And this research is just one example of that. I want to say take everything that Dr. Reem and Dr. Sausen said and just move it south east. And we'll plant that context in Jordan. Because while there are many, many differences, to be sure, and we'd love to explore those with you, I'm also really keen on showing these similarities. But I'm going to do, instead of a political economy of health, I'll do more of a political economy of labor. This project I've been looking at for the last couple of years is known variously as the Jordan Compact and the Work Permit Initiative. So just by way of background, again, just some quick stats on the Jordan context. Not to the extent and the concentration that Lebanon has, but Jordan also is one of the largest refugee host countries in the world, measured both absolutely and relatively. It had a population in 2010 of around 7 million people. Now it's just over 10 million people. Obviously, as a result, in large part of what the Jordanian government says is 1.4 million, so not quite 1.5 million. 660,000 of those are registered with the UNHCR, so that leaves another almost 800,000 more Syrians who are not registered, and that's they're doing other things. Obviously, they are also living in poverty and they're living under the radar, but nevertheless they're there, just not registered. The other obvious thing, like Lebanon, is you have over 2 million Palestinians in Jordan. So that's kind of the prologue to the Syrian refugee crisis. So as Syrians started coming into Jordan, not quite in 2011 when the war started, but trickling in 2012 and then just flooding in after that. And then especially after 2015, this million plus Syrians that we have in Jordan today are a result, especially after the 2015, coincidentally when Russia got involved in Syria. But again, unlike, I think one of you, I think it was Dr. Reed mentioned the tented settlements. I never know what to call them in Lebanon. In Jordan, we call them camps. They are UNHCR run camps, and there are about 130,000, so about 20% of all the registered refugees live in Zaatari or Azraq or the Emirati camp, among others. So that leaves about over 500,000 who are what we call urban refugees. And when we get to the political economy, like this question of that I want to look at, just some economic statistics. Jordan claims that it has spent that the cost of hosting Syrian refugees over the last 6 years has been over $10 billion US, and that it's not getting much of that paid back to it from the international community, as you pointed out, just on the healthcare issue. You know, that cuts across all sorts of things for the Jordanian government. So you have unemployment. These are the last economic data I want to throw out for the moment, just as context. Unemployment in Jordan was like 12.5% in 2010, if we can take the Jordanian government figures as fairly accurate. Then in 2016, which is the turning point, this is when the Jordan Compact came into play, and I'll tell you what that is in a second. In 2016, unemployment was higher among Jordanians, and that was around 15%, so there's a market increase. And today, well, as of December 2017, anyway, the last statistics I have, it's about 19%. So let's go back to 2016, and this project I'm looking at is, why would a country that's hosting so many refugees, that's paying a very high price, agree to this crazy idea of allowing Syrian refugees, and only Syrian refugees, not other refugees, only Syrian refugees, to work formally and to give free work permits to these Syrian refugees? So that was kind of my research hat question. We partnered with UNHCR in Jordan as they were launching this initiative in March of 2016, and they said, please help us understand how we can get more of those permits into the hands of Syrians. So this is kind of like this project that when I talked to Rami about it, I'm like, how much do I talk about research, how much about policy? He's like, well, mostly research, but we'll do a little bit of both, because for my research hat, I was like, why would a government be so nuts as to give 200,000 people formal employment opportunities? And so the policy question is, for the UNHCR, they're asking us to help them understand how can UNHCR and the ILO, the International Labor Organization, working with the government of Jordan, especially the Ministry of Labor, get more refugees to work formally. So that's kind of the questions we entered in the context. So just a brief word on our methodology. So this Jordan Compact was agreed in London at a conference to help Syria in February 2016. We happened to be in Amman in March 2016, meeting UNHCR, and they said, help us, understand this better. And so we started our research in March 2016, and it continued through the summer, through July of 2016. And we attended town hall meetings that were put on. We talked to a lot of UNHCR representatives. We talked to a lot of Syrian refugees. We talked to the ministries of labor, the labor directorates, I should say, across Jordan, and with ongoing interviews. So that's the that's the context that we enter. So here's the specifics. As I mentioned, in February 2016 at the London Conference on Supporting Syria and the Region, which is key, the government of Jordan agreed to give these permits. They pledged to create 200,000 jobs for Syrian refugees, and they measure this by the number of work permits issued. Of course, they say not. Now, the other context I didn't mention is that Jordan, even with its high unemployment, already imports, if you will, already has at least 900,000 migrant workers coming into Jordan from the Philippines or from Thailand or from Bangladesh or from wherever they may be. So the argument that UNHCR was saying, why bring in all that expat labor when you already have this labor? So that was part of the kind of the leverage that the UNHCR and the ILO could use with the government of Jordan. Like, look, just stop bringing in so many. Well, of course, I mean, we talk about corrupt officials, at least corrupt practices, but the people who bring in all that labor and go around the world and try and get that migrant labor, they're like, wait a minute, now you're talking about, these are Jordanian business folks in particular, saying now you're getting on our turf. So this is why it's very much a political economy look, not just a straight up economic question. Okay, so there are closed sectors, so Syrians could not work in education, for instance, or hairdressing, right? I mean, those two make sense, right? Engineering, medicine. So you can be a Syrian and you can get a permit, but it basically goes to manufacturing, construction, agriculture. Those are the primary open sectors. Now, in addition to this, one thing I won't be able to talk about today is the other part of this Jordan Compact, as it's known, is that in addition to jobs, Jordan also agreed to support expanded educational opportunities for Syrian refugees, which I think really kind of overlaps nicely with what you're talking about, elementary, secondary, tertiary education for Syrian refugees. That too is suffering. Syrians also are suffering, and that's where I just have not been able to look at that. But what does Jordan get in return? In return, and this, if you know anything about the Turkey-EU deal that happened around the same time of, I think it was February or March 2016, there was also a deal cut between Turkey and the EU that for every Syrian that Turkey receives back, after that Syrian goes to Greece and gets plucked out and gets sent back, there's a deal there. So Turkey was getting something, the EU was getting something. So what's Jordan getting out of this deal? And that deal is a similar thing of about $2 billion in grant pledges from the international community, World Bank loans up to $2 billion on much softer terms than Jordan had been receiving, but also granting trade benefits to the EU. So Jordan could get into the EU market more readily through this deal. So there was definitely a win-win for Jordan and the Syrian refugees. But the problem was Syrian refugees were not coming out in large numbers taking these work permits. And that's again why the UNHCR asked us to kind of look as outside observers how that could happen. So for instance, of the one final thing, King Abdullah II promised that for every job a Syrian got, 5 Jordanians would get a job. So like, oh wow, everyone is going to win here. Even Jordanians who are suffering from unemployment are going to win through this deal somehow. So as I mentioned, 200,000 work permits offered, and these were again free work permits, i.e., work permits aren't free in standard practice in Jordan. You have to pay. Someone has to pay for them, the employer or sometimes the employees have to pay to get the work permit to work. But in this case, this was also going to be free. Well, even free work permits were not being issued or not being received, and so the UNHCR, the ILO, and the government of Jordan it's kind of a troika of partners working to get these work permits out there. They had to downsize their goal. They had to lower their expectations. So instead of 200,000 permits in 6 months, they said, okay, well, if we can get 50,000 permits agreed by the end of 2016, it's still considered a victory, and we'll keep going from there. Just as of today, they still are not even at 100,000 work permits. So 2+ years later, we're still not even 50% of these permits being issued. But that's okay. So what were they doing to get the word out? Text messages, of course. How better than to spread the word than 146,000 text messages as often, as frequently as possible. But the other was the old school method of town hall meetings. So this is where we came in. We went around to these town hall meetings and observed the conversations, and it was pretty eye-opening to us at that time. But it was what we saw, and what the UNHCR and the government of Jordan clearly saw, was that, you know, convincing people to leave their informal work, where they were making pretty good money. In some cases, they were making above minimum wage. To convince them to do that was not working. It was why. This was the question we were trying to answer. Because they could have formal jobs, they could get more rights, and the ILO was especially pushing this. It's like, you have the right, you have more workers, you have more rights as a worker that you're just not receiving. And we talked about this, I think, before we even started, how Syrians just don't want to. Employers like to hire people and be able to fire them at the drop of a hat, and not pay Social Security, and not pay maternity leave, and not pay paid vacations, etc. And so there is this just this sense of for the refugees themselves, they feared, their biggest fear was to lose benefits from the UNHCR, from the international community, from the NGOs that were helping them. The other thing that happened along the way, but did not start out happening, didn't happen in 2016, but somewhere I think in 2017, if you're a Syrian if you're a refugee in a camp, you now also can work. Well, how do you do that if you're in a camp and you're not really allowed to leave the camp? Your work permit also became your permission to leave the camp. So again, what I'm saying here is that through these last 2.5 years, UNHCR, Government of Jordan, ILO, they're working on all these innovative activities. They're learning as they're going, because no one had ever done that. So I think that's the main thing here. That again, as we talked about offline, Palestinians in Lebanon aren't able to work formally for decades. Refugees in general are not able to work formally. You can, but it just the numbers were, like, Syrian refugees worked in Jordan before 2016, but the number was so small, and it was always an exception to the rule, always an exception to the rule. So it might have been 3,000 people in any given year, Syrians that were working. So so this is still the conundrum, I guess, and the puzzle we're trying to solve. So what I want to say is that we're certainly nowhere near the end of this research. We're certainly nowhere near the success of getting 200,000 Syrians working. We're going back starting next week, actually, the day after our Boston event at Harvard. We get on a plane and we go to Jordan for 5-6 weeks and do more of that. So I will just say that there are structural and other impediments to this. It's hard to say that because the government of Jordan has allowed Syrians to work formally. We know they're all working informally. Many tens and tens of thousands of Syrians are working informally in the Jordanian economy. But the economy is also compressing. Jordan's economy is compressing. Would it be compressing worse or less worse, rather, if it didn't also have the burden of 1.3 or 1.4 million Syrians on its territory? Is the regional economy compressing faster, i.e. worsening more because of the Syrian refugee crisis and the Yemen crisis and Saudi-Iran crisis and all the other crises, and the Saudi-Qatar crisis and all these other crises. We can't know these things. So we can't therefore say that Jordan's unemployment rate is worsening because of this. So those are certainly things and I'm not an economist, so I tread lightly even on these questions. We also see that Jordan has always had a strong informal labor market. We also sadly see that women hardly participate in that labor market. Jordan is one of the worst economies for women's participation in the region. So what are we going to try to recommend more? Okay, absolutely. I'm wrapping up. So a lot of, if you know anything about the stereotype of Zaatari refugee camp in the 2014, 15, and 16 time frame, you might have heard of Champs-Élysées. So you know just from the refugee camp proper that Syrian refugees are innovative, are entrepreneurial, and they created an economy within Zaatari that was a pretty impressive economy. And then if you know anything about Syrian restaurants throughout Amman, you also know that Syrian business folks are, again, very entrepreneurial. Well, we hope that UNHCR and the ILO and the government of Jordan will allow more small and micro enterprises and more home-based businesses, which will really impact women, because a lot of women can and want to do home-based businesses, and a lot of them are doing that informally, but that has not yet been opened in this Jordan Compact, in this work permit initiative. So we hope to argue, I think we can argue, that small and micro enterprises and home-based businesses should also be part of this compact. If you can give women work permits to work in the home, you're going to get a lot more women working in the home. The other issue is vocational training. So when we were at our, I'll wrap up with this anecdote. When we were at at one of the town halls, well, actually several of the town halls, we kept hearing mothers say, "I've got two very able-bodied sons, let them work." But my sons are 15 and 16, or 16 and 17, so they're under the 18-year-old legal work age. And so if we could just maybe get them into vocational training programs, internships, then these also might be, in 1 to 2 years, then they can be legally enabled to work. So there's a lot of research questions left. There's a lot of policy questions left. I am not paid by UNHCR, by the way, so I don't fit into any of those. And I just want to wrap up with this, that's the beauty of BCARS. BCARS is a research group, it's a research network, and we partner with policy actors and practitioners, and we say, we are free labor, and you don't have to pay us because the labor is, and you'll get to experience some of the best partnerships we have of working with junior faculty, such as Alicia, who's going to tell you more about her work, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dennis. We're going to have one more speaker here, and then we're going to turn over to Beirut, where Carmen's going to make a couple comments, and we'll then open up the discussion for about 45 minutes or so. This is the first time we do a briefing like this with 4 faculty and a 5th in Beirut, so it's going to be 2 hours rather than an hour and a half. Just a point I want to make about what Dennis mentioned about the link to policy. This is one of the big questions that academics are always looking at, beyond the fact that they want to publish and get promoted, which is understandable. But the next question is, well, all that information that academics generate from research, how is it useful to policymakers, to the private sector, to international agencies? And this is a critical opportunity now in the research being done on refugees and host government policies. How can research really be useful here? We have 65 or so professors at AUB working on refugee-related issues. It's an extraordinary network. And policy linkages is one of the areas that we're focusing on. This is directed by Dr. Nasser Yassin, coordinated by him. And so in the future, we'll look at how we and BCARS can work together, particularly on the policy impact question with the UNHCR government agencies and things like that. So thank you for mentioning those issues. So now we moved from social stresses and interactions with host communities to maternal health conditions, opportunities, to labor. Now we will finish here with Alice Verticelli giving us a briefing on her research on the status of refugees as they seek refuge, asylum, assistance, anything to improve their condition in Europe, and what she has found out from that. So, tafadali, Alice.
Thank you very much to you all for coming, and thank you to AUB and Beirut for allowing me to be here and present a little bit of my research that's been taking me to different places for the past couple of years, and will keep taking me to other places at least for the next 2 years. So it's a long project, but so my focus, as you've introduced me, is on EU migration and asylum policy. So again, the link between the research and policy here is that I'm researching policy. From the politics of crisis to the effects of securitization. And here I will focus on Europe's migration and asylum policy, trying to capture the dynamic interaction of its design, policy implementation, and then its effects and impact on migrants and refugees themselves. There's a lot more that I'll be able to speak about in just a few minutes, but we'll leave something for hopefully the questions afterwards. So my main focus is on the one hand on crisis, right? What does it mean? Where does it come from? What are its dynamics and consequences? And thanks to Dr. Reem's presentation, we have all the main ingredients here. Threat to jobs, she mentioned, aid as exploiting the system of aid, crime, violence against women, threat to the value system and way of life, rise in anti-immigrant politicians. These are all the main ingredients of the Europe migrant crisis or Europe refugee crisis. But my other focus is also on borders, right? What happens at borders? How do policies shape borders? And then how do migrants reshape them? I see borders as a place of control, of filtering, of counting, of identifying, of mobility, sometimes of immobility when people get stuck at borders for days and sometimes weeks. But also as dynamic places that are designed just as much by the actions that are more or less deliberately political actions of humanitarian workers. And more importantly, they're also shaped and designed just as much by migrant agencies, which are again, more or less deliberately political, but have very, very political consequences. So I'll try to go quickly through the policy phases in turn. I'll start with EU policy design and what happens there, policy implementation, what happens on the ground, and then its effects on migrants and refugees towards the end, which is my current research. In terms of policy design, the big driver was crisis, right? So my first task will be to unpack and deconstruct this concept of crisis. My basic argument is that what has been portrayed and perceived as a migrant crisis was instead a political crisis within the EU and between EU member states. Europe's economies, societies, and institutions could be resilient enough to take in far greater numbers than they did. And I'll have some numbers just to give you a sense in proportion to what we've been talking about so far in the region of what's happening in Europe, what's happened in Europe. So when we think about Europe's crisis, what comes to mind are probably overcrowded boats or dinghies being rescued in the Mediterranean. If we do a little bit more research, we probably encounter maps, and these maps are circulated within circles of EU policymakers as well as by think tanks locally, etc., of basically Europe, and then big red arrows all point from all different directions, all pointing towards Europe. And they serve the purposes that they serve, but they are incredibly misleading. They're a gross misrepresentation of reality because, so let's take a first step. In general, globally, 86% of the world's refugees today reside in low or middle income countries, against 70% 20 years ago. So more and more of the refugees are in the global south. Right? Moreover, if we consider just the EU, what is often labeled as irregular migration, which includes asylum seekers and refugees, because there's no options for humanitarian visas and whatnot, constitutes only a fraction of the total number of mobile people in Europe. According to Eurostat data, for example, in 2016, there were 54.5 million migrants in the EU. About half of these were Europeans themselves, of European origin, right? But of course, these numbers are used in different ways. On the other hand, between 2009 and 2016, there were about 2 million irregular migrant arrivals, including Mediterranean, land, and by the Atlantic as well. And of these, about 1,800,000 to Italy and Greece alone, by the Mediterranean. On speaking about Syrians, only about Syrians, right, according to UN data, asylum applications in the whole EU from 2011 to 2016 were slightly over 1 million, over a total population in the EU of 510 million people. In comparison, as we've heard in part, right, Syrian's neighboring states, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, have around 3 million, and these numbers, of course, are disputed, but just to give you a sense, 1.5 million and about 1 million Syrian refugees, respectively, though their populations, their economic resources, and their strength in terms of institutional and economic strength fall greatly behind the highly developed European states. And also many analysts have pointed out the potential for integration of refugees into developed economies and societies with aging populations for different reasons. Primarily, these scholars are economists, but there's plenty of other studies from different fields. But here we are at our starting point, crisis, right? Despite all of this, the crisis mode. So this crisis mode, being fueled by decision makers and the media, and in turn the public opinion, strengthened the narrative link between migration and security, primarily terrorism, instead of, for example, other potential narrative frames that could have applied, asylum and rights, for example, just to throw one out there. With the subsequent social construction of these target populations of migrants and refugees as undeserving. Victims at best, when it comes to refugees that are coming from war-torn countries, more often burdens, if not threats, to security or to the economic prosperity of these countries. So this crisis that has been, what has been portrayed and constructed as a refugee crisis, it opened up, what happened at the policy level, it opened up a window of opportunity for quick decision making, right? Leading to increased integration at the supranational level and more securitized and militarized interventions. And so what it could have seemed like something that could have kind of torn the EU apart and different member states having conflicting interests, it actually served as a way to strengthen the union, but in ways that were unpredicted, right? In securitized and militarized ways. Again, this crisis has taken the meaning of threat, facing the security and prosperity of the host states and host communities. But let's not forget that the main crisis is humanitarian. There is a humanitarian crisis that is facing incoming migrants and asylum seekers, as well as a political crisis facing decision makers that is still ongoing. So this so-called crisis generated this dynamic of positive feedback loop and a cascade effect that has led to quick policy change toward more integrated security-centric policies. This is evident from primary data, a methodology that I collected through interviews with the EU decision makers in Brussels, primarily in the EU Commission, but also from a whole array of secondary data. We analyzed the change in tone of European policy directives and action plans, documents, political actors' speeches, both at the national but primarily the EU level, the coverage in the media, that is the shift in the coverage in the media, right, from images of women and children sleeping in the streets to bearded men with black flags, sometimes even taken out of context, or sometimes even with the rise of fake news taken from other countries. So the portrayal in the media, but also budget allocation. Quantitatively, we analyzed budget allocations to agencies such as Frontex, the border agency, the border and coast guard agency of the EU. It has spiked expenditures, international agreements, and we'll touch upon very briefly the EU-Turkey deal. And more importantly, also the Eurobarometer polls, which measure public opinion and public attitudes. So this is at the level of policymakers, media, and citizens, right, European citizens. On the policy design front, the pattern of securitization can be traced to the 2015 EU Agenda on Migration and all the subsequent documents. This was the kind of bigger framework, right? And then all the subsequent documents, action plans, reports, recommendations, communication that EU policymakers crafted in response to this migration crisis. These documents are often coupling together the agenda on migration and the agenda on security, which deals primarily with terrorism, so how to avoid the infiltration of terrorists, and especially after Brussels and Paris. Priority is given to identification, fingerprinting, and detention, revealing this push towards efficiency, quantification, and control of people crossing the border, right? The Eurodac system, which is the digitalized system for identification and fingerprinting, and the hotspot approach, which deals with detention centers or reception centers, are symptoms of this. Okay. Moreover, a big priority is given to combating smuggling, and combating smuggling sometimes has taken the shape of the criminalization of solidarity and the imprisonment of humanitarian workers who were basically there trying to rescue people from boats. And guaranteeing returns, another big priority. Securing bilateral agreements sometimes with country of origin or transit to guarantee deportations. It was probably a failure in implementing deportations that led to more recent documents addressing the partnership framework with countries of origin and of transit to manage migration before it even arrives to Europe's border, what is commonly referred to as the externalization of borders to, for example, Turkey, countries of origin, even Niger, and countries of transit. Right? So more coordinated militarized interventions at the border, stronger EU presence in search and rescue operations and identification. So we see Frontex on boats, in hotspots, these detention centers. At every step, there is a strong EU involvement alongside national authorities, sometimes substituting them. And in terms of the border countries, Greece and Italy, in Greece sometimes even more than Italy, there's been this delegation of authority from the national to the EU level. So crisis also meant that the problem was defined in a certain way, security threat instead of, for example, humanitarian crisis, and therefore the competence for handling the crisis was given to specific departments within the EU bureaucracy. Right? Primarily DG Home within the EU Commission, which is basically the EU's interior ministry. Right? And of course, on the one hand, there's many agencies that have programs concerning migration and asylum and borders, right, leading to an overlapping narratives and also overlapping competence with an overall kind of messy policy environment if you add on top of that all the policies that individual member states have in place. But also, because this the primary competence was at DG Home, we have to keep in mind that the position that a bureaucrat holds within the bureaucracy shapes the way politicians frame and act in terms of policy, right? So again, this reinforced this policy narratives and further amplified securitization. So overall, we see the policy becoming increasingly and gradually supernatural, integrated at the EU level, and more securitized. Now let's shift from policies and to policy implementation, right? So a push for securitization and administrative efficiency led to grouping of migrants according primarily to country of origin, unofficially, sometimes officially, sometimes unofficially. The dismissal of migrants' agency and the subsequent creation of formal and informal boundaries of inclusion, exclusion, and otherness, which hindered access to rights, individual assessments. The EU-Turkey deal is a prime example of this, where every person that comes, another person goes, without any consideration of the individual rights of the person arriving. And in the long-term, potential integration, also hindering potential integration into host economies and societies. This process begins at the border. The border takes various forms in the way I intended, right? From the outsourced borders in other countries, with the EU-Turkey deal, agreements with Niger, Libya, the Libyan Coast Guard, and other African countries. At sea, right, in detention facilities or hotspots, as a mechanism for counting, filtering, categorizing, and rejecting, but also defenses and points of closure within countries or between individual countries, for example, along the Balkan routes. So upon arrival, sometimes at sea, refugees are asked questions and given questionnaires that we've been analyzing, often poorly translated and sometimes with misleading questions. For example, that didn't include war as the reason for their journey, so it wasn't an option to kind of take, right? Subsequently, they're categorized mostly according to where they come from, right? Their country of origin. For example, I'll just give two quick examples. In the Greek hotspots, new arrivals from countries with asylum claim recognition rates that are below 25% are channeled into fast-track border procedure on the basis of nationality, which often means they're given a deportation kind of paper. In Italy, more recently, third country consular authorities now help with identification of asylum seekers for certain nationalities, for example, Nigeria. So you have a person claiming asylum from a country and you have a representative of that country helping authorities identify that person. EU member states have not yet developed a common list of safe countries of origin, but the EU created a criterion. Asylum seekers that are holding nationalities with recognition rates of 75% or higher are eligible on paper for relocation. This was until the end of 2017 because the relocation program has stopped completely, to another EU member state. Now, quick note, the EU Dublin system that is currently in place says that the first country of entry, so where you go first, which usually is Italy or Greece, sometimes Spain, is the country where you have to claim asylum. And there is no official system apart from the small numbers in relocation to redistribute these migrants, which led to kind of illegal crossings between countries, right? So according to this legal mechanism, you have to be 75% or higher recognition rate to be eligible for it. But of course, the numbers that were pledged were not fulfilled, and the relocation scheme was discontinued completely in September 2017. Now, ironically, the 75% criterion led to this very short list of countries from which you were eligible for relocation, which included some war-torn countries, Yemen, Syria, etc., but also countries that have just sent such small numbers, and it happened that a lot of those who were sent, maybe 10 people, 8 of them were accepted, and therefore they were in the list, such as the United Arab Emirates, Bahamas, etc. So by policymakers and the media, migrants are thus portrayed as either vulnerable victims who might access services provided top-down, or more often burdens to host communities, resources, or even security threats to be eliminated by returns and deportations. At the implementation phase, obviously things get even messier, right? And different actors with different and competing sometimes narratives and interests make borders a particularly interesting place. Right? Different actors on the ground include EU agents, national authorities, obviously, humanitarian workers, local residents, and refugees and migrants themselves, who all interpret, implement, contest, or react to EU policies, reshaping borders as these dynamic places of control and political action. Now, I'll quickly, now that I'm going towards the end, talk about policy effects, which is the focus of my current research, right? I focus on the micro effects of EU securitization on migrants and refugees. Now, there's plenty of studies on criminalization and securitization that usually focus on the policy process as a top-down mechanism with little concern for its micro effects, and especially for its feedback mechanisms, right? But I try to focus on these feedback mechanisms of the policy processes underpinning securitization of borders and migration. And my research thus recenters the debate around the mutually constitutive nature of migration and state borders. By the end of the study, I will have conducted 100 in-depth interviews with migrants, and as well as focus groups. And my preliminary findings suggest that valuable insights can be taken from the political psychology literature of first impressions formation. Now, in a nutshell, basically what I claim is that first impressions that migrants build of the EU and of EU agents at the border can have long-lasting consequences when coupled with group dynamics and prior information. And they can hinder cooperation, trust, and long-term integration, basically undermining a lot of the policy goals that the EU would pose for itself, as well as its fundamental values. Right? So this exploration of the psychology literature of first impressions sheds light on this important and potentially detrimental long-term consequences of militarization. As I mentioned, even in terms of future integration. And I'll stop here by, if any question comes up, I might mention a couple of anecdotes to exemplify. No, it's okay. I'll stop here, and then I can mention maybe an anecdote during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Radhika. Now we turn to Beirut. Thank you for being so patient over there in Beirut. And Carmen Jaha, who is assistant professor at AUB, has done work on many different areas, including refugees. So, Carmen, could you give us a couple of comments, your own comments, feedback on this wide range of material that we've heard, and then we'll start maybe with the first question from others in Beirut, since you've all been patient, and then we'll come back here and have questions and comments from here.
Hi, good morning, New York. Thank you so much for having me on this stellar panel to discuss, as you said, Rami, this wide-ranging approach to looking at the different phases of Arab refugeehood. I'll be very brief and say that really what struck me is some notes from Dr. Berticelli's presentation, where she said what has been portrayed and perceived as a migrant crisis was instead a political crisis within the EU. And I want to say that that is true as well for Lebanon and for Jordan. I thought that each of your presenters was looking at a different story and different sides of the story, starting with Dr. Saad's focus on threats and tensions and perceptions, both on behalf of Syrians and of Lebanese. And I think this is a story from Dr. Saad's perspective of a protracted tragedy and continued fear on both ends. And I want to say also that that in itself is politically motivated and often politically infused given the context of Lebanon. I greatly enjoyed Dr. Abdurrahim's presentation and sort of gendering the crisis and looking at how public health in crisis is in fact much more disfavorable to women and to young women. And her focus on the historical aspect of women's life choices and how, pre-crisis trajectories make women more susceptible to early marriage and health issues. And I thought that that was a story that is also political within the context of Lebanon. Dr. Sullivan's story takes place at the intersection of sort of the local, national, international orders in which Jordan has managed to offer a model of work permits. And the story of work permits then becomes also a story for mobility and the freedom of moving in and around and the entire politics of camphood in Jordan. That is also a political story. I want to suggest, perhaps just to add an angle for our morning briefing today, New York to Beirut, is that we can begin to learn how to integrate political context and incentives for main actors in order to address these issues. As you rightly pointed out, Rami, we need to learn as academics to produce policy that is not normative, but that is locally grounded and locally applicable. And I think that there is no way to discuss the refugee crisis without discussing politics. And so perhaps you speak us towards the end to brainstorm or at least to start this discussion between, as you said, the AUB for refugees academics working here at AUB and academics in the US, is to look at politics by identifying specific actors, specific incentives of those actors that would cause them to address or not to address a refugee crisis, and also to map out the different drivers for policymaking in the region. And these are, again, very, very different, but also still politically infused, whether that is Europe, Jordan, or Lebanon. So thank you so much for having me. We'll open it up. We had more people in the room, but the sound wasn't very good, but we still have a couple of interventions. How would you like us to do this, Rami? Would you like me to ask a question from Beirut?
Yes, why don't we have the first comment or question from somebody there, and then we'll come back here and go back and forth.
Hello, my name is Charlotte Karam, and I am an associate professor of organizational behavior at the business school here in Beirut. And I think my question focuses, so some of the work I do is look at private sector's response to the refugee crisis, particularly around humanitarian responses and engaging in humanitarian responses within the MENA region. And so I think my question goes out to ask about the silence that we feel within the MENA region, or at least what I perceive to be a silence of the private sector. So you have many actors that do it in a philanthropic way, but don't want to be recognized. At least it's the case here in Lebanon from my own research. So I just wanted to hear some comments. I think dovetailing on what Carmen was saying in terms of how can different actors be encouraged, with a particular focus on private sector, to be more engaged in humanitarian relief.
Who would like to comment on that here?
Yeah, I could. Well, I know that, thank you very much for your question. And it's certainly something that I've been aware of for at least 4 years, I'd say, doing research in Jordan and starting in Zaatari camp. I think it was 2000, might be about late 2013, early 2014. I know Google and these major corporations. I mean that's almost reaching too high. I think for your question, in respect to your question, I'd like to bring it way back down, but I do know that there's a lot of actors out there who are trying to both respond due to corporate social responsibility, but also the sense of the corporate side of the house. So I do know that there are corporations engaged, trying to get engaged in education in particular. For instance, this thing that Google was trying to explore, they were asking how can colleges and universities in the United States and in Europe deliver these, the MOOCs or whatever, the online classes, among other things. I don't see that that's happening, by the way. So that's why I'd like to bring this down more to a more reasonable level of the corporate social responsibility, but also with the profit incentive that is there. I still think that the vast majority of the impetus comes from Syrians themselves, at least in Jordan. Jordan is awash with Syrian business people, obviously starting with restaurants, I'm sorry to say. I'm not sorry to eat it, but I'm sorry to say that it's the heavy focus is on restaurants, the food industry, things like that, and it's not in education. And then you do have things though, you do have enterprises like the Syrian American Medical Association, or Syrian American Medical Relief. They're certainly getting involved. My point is I see so few, these are more anecdotal than real data. One last one is where Syrian psychologists based in the United States have been delivering via Skype and other video conference techniques a lot of the psychosocial help that Syrian refugees need, but also Syrian internally displaced Syrians and otherwise Syrians back home who need that. So I'm just talking. These are scattershot. This is a scattershot answer to a wonderful question that I wish I had a better response to, because that would mean there's a lot more businesses doing that.
I should give you some advanced notice that Charlotte is going to be in the U.S. Next fall on sabbatical, and we plan to have a briefing with her as the lead speaker here, with a particular focus on this question of business, private sector, refugees, and how that whole process can be examined and promoted.
Excellent.
Comments, questions here? Who would like to start? Introduce yourself, please,
Yes.
also.
I'm Rima Salah, and I'm a faculty at Yale University at the Child Study Center, but I'm also with the UN on the UN Committee for Refugees and Migrants. And what you said, Dr. Rami Khoury, that all this research that is being done is so important for the UN also, as we are preparing two compacts, the Compact on Refugees and the Compact on Migration. On migrants, let's say, and the two compacts will be presented to the General Assembly at the end of this year. So I was wondering, how can we link this research to the compacts, and how can we introduce it to the compacts?
Thank you. That's a good question, which I'll let our participants answer. I'll just add one point that I was in Geneva a few months ago speaking to the senior management of UNHCR, and then Filippo Grande, the director, was in Beirut and gave a talk at AUB. And our people at AUB, the AUB for Refugees faculty, through Nasser Yassin, have been in touch with the UNHCR at a regional level. So we're exploring how do we actually set up some kind of formal or informal mechanism, which BCARS will be a part of as well, where and others around the world, where we can at least identify all the available research that people have done, and then figure out how do you channel it to policymakers at the national level, international level, international NGOs, and all the other people who might make use of it. Comments from the speakers on that?
Well, I mean, my first thought is that I think it depends on the kinds of research and where they're coming from. So in my case, for example, the project was commissioned by Save the Children. So the report that we produced was directly shared online with the UNHCR and the relevant actors, so it's already fed into their database. But I think when the research is coming, is generated by the universities themselves without necessarily the direct link with the policymakers, then I think the challenge becomes bigger, and this is where we need to be creative in terms of thinking of links. I'm not sure about Southland's research, if it's was it generated by AUB itself, or was it funded by organizations on the ground, or?
I mean, I completely agree that it's important to link research with policy making, to inform policies at the UN or government policies. In some cases, I believe it's important to think about some research questions and to provide answers for them through research independently. And then it would be great that, if the UN or other bodies take that research and incorporate it into their policies. So it can be both. It can be research that is from the beginning designed to address policy issues, and in other cases it can be research for the purpose of generating knowledge, and then policymakers at different levels, local, governmental or international, can take the outcome of that research and incorporate it into their policies.
I just want to add that I just want to use our own case study, if you will, as a response to that, because this document that we produced, this research for policy impact is what we produced, is that we went in sort of like you just said, that we were doing our own independent research on a similar topic, and all of a sudden, because we had an in at UNHCR through one of my students who happened to be an intern there, that just was serendipity. Well, then we created an MOU, as the UNHCR must have. We agreed that we are independent researchers. I must say that when I said I'm not being paid by UNHCR, this is not free. Research isn't free. Someone has to pay for it, and I want to just take the time to say thanks to the Carnegie Corporation in New York, because they're the ones that have been sponsoring BCARS and all of our activities for the last five and a half years. That said, we are an independent body. We have junior, senior scholars, as Rami pointed out, from AUB and AUC, and now in Jordan and all over Boston and elsewhere. So I think the point is to get policymakers and researchers at this table and talk about what are our research methods, what are our research questions, what are your interests. So I think it's very much about not just depending on serendipity, it's about making serendipity happen by forcing us all around the table and speaking. And that's why we want to do this kind of workshop and more like it.
If I can just add one point, there are some wonderful initiatives that are happening. Dr. Sullivan and I, for example, last October, we were in Cairo for a conference on responsibility sharing for refugees in the Euro-Mediterranean space. And the output of this very rich conference was a document that was shared with UNHCR, which included some recommendations and measures, suggestions to include in the Global Compact on refugees, among which, for example, the inclusion of academics and research, not only in the preparatory process for the program of action, but also in its implementation phase, which would be a wonderful addition. Maybe we can share this. But it's so important to link these two.
That's a good question.
Any other comments, questions from Fadali? Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Yasemin Corzo, and I'm from Sesame Workshop. So, Tahia Simpson and Kaya Tinson for all of you. And so I am working specifically with early childhood education, and also now we're looking at caregivers and mothers. And this is kind of specifically around the social cohesion and also the maternal and women's health. You spoke about the social cohesion between host country and refugee populations as adults, I guess. But how has that translated into children, and then if you can, specifically into early childhood? I know that's a big ask. And then also around women's health, how everything that you presented on the relationship between women and mothers and their children, especially the early childhood, and if you have anything to really talk about between those relationships, because we're looking at that as well through home visits. So if you could give me information.
So thank you for the question. I think you're absolutely right. We didn't really look at children in our project, and I think it's very important when thinking of social cohesion and the future of social cohesion of starting early, right? So we don't know how long Syrians are going to be in Lebanon, and so we really need to think of building these strong ties from early age. And so on. And I think these are questions that are being addressed by some projects on reduction of discrimination at the school level, increasing access to schools, etc. I mean, some of the direct things I can think of from our research are, for example, when you have Syrians struggling to renew their legal residence permits, that also means that they don't send their children to schools. Children that are being born and are not registered and have difficulties registering also will have difficult access to education. This means greater segregation among communities, we have from our data figures that just suggest that more segregation, less frequent contact is associated with more negative attitudes towards the other community. So these are obviously things that need to definitely be considered. I'm sorry that I don't have data that speaks directly to your question.
Thanks. In terms of a relationship to my presentation on maternal health, I think one of the things that are important to think about is the possibility of breaking the cycle of disadvantage. So I mentioned that we cannot understand or we cannot act upon effectively the health of Syrian adolescent girls in Lebanon, given the low social capital that their parents have. And one of the things that are happening in Lebanon is that children who became displaced and came to Lebanon at age 13, 14, 15, unfortunately lost years of education and dropped out of school, and it became extremely difficult to bring them back to school. However, what is happening now, what the data is showing, is that children who came at a young age and started to attend school from first grade are doing fine, they're doing well. The complaints about the French and English curriculum and other things don't apply to those who came at a young age. So definitely early childhood development and education, if resources are put into that, there is a potential of breaking the cycle of disadvantage. I can think about the Palestinian case where a lot of the children in 1948 who didn't go to school, who wouldn't have gone to school, started to go to school, to UNRWA schools later on, children from rural and poor families. So it's definitely important to focus a lot of the resources and a lot of the energy on education of both boys and girls at a very young age, because I think if they start at a good point, then the school dropout, the probability of dropping out of school will decrease in the adolescents.
Thank you.
I think she had her hand up.
تفضل.
Thank you so much. My name is Hanan Al-Badawi.
Can you raise your voice a bit?
My name is Hanan Al-Badawi. I worked at Yale University for some time, and I currently work with the Atlantic Council. Actually, my question is about the more broader policy question of the future of Syrian refugee communities in both Lebanon and Jordan, because all what we have been tackling is that this is a temporary situation, and as you just mentioned, we do not know how long this temporary situation is. And I think as of this year, everybody is talking about, well, it's time for refugees to return home. So was any part of the research linked to long-term aspects of the Syrian refugee community's presence?
In my in our study, we address more perceptions, right, more so than the policies that are being planned, because our aim really was to look at social cohesion from the perspective of Lebanese and Syrians. And one of the questions we asked both communities is how long they think that the Syrians are going to be in Lebanon for. And the Lebanese, 50% of them thought that the Syrians will never return. And about 30% said that they were unsure, I think something along those lines, and a minority said that they will return within the next 5 years. Now, since 2015, it's almost 5 years, and of course the majority have not returned. The Syrians, on the other hand, were more optimistic. So there was definitely a substantial proportion saying they don't know, but I think there was only a minority saying that they will never return. So it just tells you a little bit about the outlook that they have. And I think in our focus groups, there were definitely very negative, there was a very negative outlook on the future among both communities. There's a big fear of deterioration, of unknown, unforeseen consequences for the future. So definitely at the social, psychological level, this isn't being lived as just a temporary crisis for a couple of years. It's just going to be resolved. Yeah. And I think that it's definitely important here that we cannot think of this anymore as a humanitarian crisis where we just need to deliver humanitarian aid, but we need to think of long-term development projects and so on. And I think aid organizations and governments have started to realize this to some extent.
Yeah, Jordan is exactly in this situation. So as I mentioned, refugees started coming in the summer of 2012. Yeah, they thought it was temporary, they being everybody. So they started collecting them in this area that we now know as Zaatari. So if you just look at the evolution of Zaatari refugee camp as a camp, and then the expansion of camps beyond that to Azraq camp now, that shows you the mindset of everybody from 2012 till today. But what I mean by that is, yeah, people thought this was temporary, this was going to go away in 6 months, maybe a year. Assad will be toppled and it'll be like Egypt and Tunisia and everyone can go home. Well, by 2014, everyone started talking about the protracted nature of this conflict in Jordan, anyway. So it's a protracted refugee situation that gets us into the anywhere from 17 to 20 year average stay of a refugee. These are the statistics that are always, we never know if it's 17 or 18 or 20, whatever. But this work permit initiative that I talked about is very much a response to that. It's very much a policy response, as you were asking, to the reality that Syrians are not going anywhere anytime soon. And I concur with Dr. Reem that this has not been about humanitarian assistance for at least 4 or 5 years. This is about long-term development assistance. So it's taken the international community, whoever those people are when we say that, it's taken them too much time to get to the reality that this is about long-term development. And again, I'll say that we have to talk about the host communities, the impact on host communities simultaneously and equal to the impact on Syrians who are refugees. So that's the other thing. The Work Permit Initiative very much talks about, okay, we're not going to get to King Abdullah's, for every one, we're going to get 5 Jordanians employed. That ain't going to happen. But for every dollar that's invested in a refugee, $1 should be invested in a Jordanian child, mother, worker, whatever, whether it's Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey.
Nahid?
My name is Anahid Haddan. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at AUB and a visiting professor in Middle East Studies at Columbia University. So I want to first say thank you very much for all your presentations and the amount of data that has gone into them. It's so rich. I just want to go back to the question of policy and the link to policy and knowledge. And yes, I agree, it's very important. And the kind of research you're all producing and the richness, I think, testifies that. But I just also want to kind of put forward the question of what kind of knowledge gets produced for policy, and the questions of history and historicization of this knowledge, because when we produce these kind of questions for policymakers without a longer durée over how we've gotten to this point, then what kind of knowledge are we feeding into this policy? And just to give more concrete examples, I mean, I heard this in your presentation, Selson, it was great, the way in which, in order to understand maternal, women access to health in Lebanon today, we need to understand pre-migration access and so forth. And then in the other presentations, for example, I was interested, Dream, in the question of, well, what kind of relationships did these communities have before 2011 to the ones in Afkar? So I heard hints, they're the same sectarian communities, what kind of links happen, and could that perhaps enrich or deepen our understandings of how these communities were received, or explain further some of these perceptions? And likewise, in some of the presentations I heard across the table, so in relation to the question of the securitization of EU borders, was it really with 2011 and 12, or were certain bodies labeled as Muslim and non-European and so forth already part of the securitization, which begins with really 9/11 and so forth? And and the same could be said about the permit system, I suppose, and the role of the Jordanian state vis-a-vis these different refugee groups that have come over the past 50 years, vis-a-vis the Iraqis before that, or the Palestinians who came from Kuwait and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that when we think about the relationship between knowledge and policy, and what kind of knowledge gets produced from policy, if we just kind of try to push back historically and think more about how can we influence policy with this long durée, is it more useful, is it more impactful, and so forth? And I just would like to hear your opinions in relation to the knowledge that you've come up with. And just finally, because this struck me when I was hearing you in particular, Dennis, you're always saying why the permits? We're trying to figure out why, and it seems to me, well, history, maybe that's where the answer is as well. So I just, would like to hear what you have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can start. Thank you for this question. I love it, and that's a long part of my research is putting this into context, right? Because especially in the European context, it's so important, and it goes way back than 9/11, right, to colonization. And also, my research is not narrowly focused on Syrians, but it looks at migration and asylum policy more generally. So it's even more relevant to contextualize these things into scope geographically and in time. So the history of colonization is so crucial, as well as the global inequalities and other phenomena that are driving migration. And I think, of course, in terms of the link to policy and how impactful our policy impact can be if we ground it more in history, I don't know, because policymakers want something quick and now. They don't want very long post-colonial kind of essays about what happened decades ago, unfortunately. But of course, as researchers, our duty is to contextualize things. So of course, we must do that when we write policy papers, more targeted, maybe trim and go straight to the point. So I think it's so crucial to contextualize these things, and also in a way that's forward-thinking, because all this helps us think of how the policies that are being enacted, at least in terms of the EU, are, and this links back to Dr. Al-Badawi's question, that are so narrow and short time, because they're focusing on the temporary nature and on kind of bandages. How can we stop this now so that I can win the next election, right? So reinforce the borders, make the migrant or the refugee the other in terms of their being Muslim or their being whatever. But this doesn't take into account the fact that migration won't stop. And this is where migrant agency comes into play. It's not like if you put a fence here, migration is going to come from somewhere else, because there are these underlying historical and inequalities and global inequalities that are driving it, even beyond war and conflicts, right? So people are on the move. They have been on the move. They will keep being on the move. We can't just, try to reach an agreement with Turkey or securitize the borders, because this will keep happening. And then the measures that we put into place, even in European countries, are inadequate. And I'll give a very short example from my field research in Lampedusa, which is this tiny island that's Italian, but it's closer to Tunisia than Italy in reality, and that's where, at least in the beginning, most of the boats are coming to. So the hotspot in Lampedusa, these hotspots are detention centers that were historically named first reception centers run by Italian authorities, then renamed identification and expulsion centers by Italian authorities, and then taken over by European authorities and called hotspots, which nobody knows what it means until they look it up. It's such a generic term. And these are places where EU and Italian authorities and in Greece, Greek authorities cooperate for basically identifying, fingerprinting, and then sending migrants somewhere else, right? Or refugees somewhere else. And they're supposed to stay there 48 to a maximum of 72 hours. Now, as you can imagine, this doesn't happen, right? They stay there for weeks, sometimes for months, right? So there's little things such as the fire that the migrants protested in 2016, which basically destroyed half of it. So what they have done is basically, and they're not supposed to leave this place, right? They're not supposed to leave it and roam into the city. So what they've done, they created a hole into the fence deliberately. Like the policemen have gone and kind of dug a hole into the fence so that nobody knows, they're kind of getting out as thieves and getting to the local NGO to get internet connection and talk to their family in Syria or Morocco or wherever, or Nigeria, and then come back at night. Nobody knows they're there. If something happens, nothing happens. So this, I think, like this hole in the fence can be a metaphor for this whole approach that is so decoupled by reality, historically and geographically. So thank you for that question. I'll have my anecdote.
This is a very interesting question. I think generally one of the things that we tend to do when we think of social cohesion challenges is that we can make the mistake of looking more at the who is at risk for the breakdown of social cohesion. So we look at the risk factors, but we don't look at the protective factors, right? So we can also think of a more positive approach in terms of looking at what are the factors that are protecting these communities from further breakdown. And so here the history is a very important one. So in the Bekaa and in Akkar, there are kinship ties. So there are many Lebanese that have married Syrians and vice versa. So there's a history of intermarriage between the two communities. There's also a history of commercial relations. So several of the Lebanese we spoke with basically told us we would go shopping to Damascus, we wouldn't go to Beirut because Damascus is much cheaper. And of course there's also the idea that the fact that we had about 300,000 or so, if not more, Syrian workers in Lebanon before the refugee crisis. And so sometimes these workers were seasonal, and then they ended up staying, they brought their families with them. So there are some protective factors in that sense that we should keep in mind. But at the same time, there are negative factors historically that add to the perceptions of threat and concern. For example, some of the people we spoke with, some of the Syrians we spoke with would talk about how the Lebanese would discriminate against them, and when the Syrians would say, "Why are you doing this to me?" They'd say, "Well, because your army has done this and that to my people," and they were like, "Well, that wasn't me." And then the response would be, "If it wasn't you, it's your dad or your uncle." So there's a history of tension with the Syrian army presence in Lebanon, and of course there's a Palestinian factor, the history of the Palestinian refugees, which is again which heightens threats. And unlike in Jordan, we have a sectarian political system in Lebanon, so there's fears by several communities that if the, just like with the Palestinians, that if the Syrians stay and they gain the nationality at some point, that the Sunnis will become the majority in the country, and this will alter the political system in the country. So I think all of these are playing a factor. A historical look is definitely. And I just want to add one thing as well, that at the policy level, when you talked about how there's a growing rhetoric about that the Syrians must return, and of course the conditions not being adequate for them to return. And I think the politicians in our country have been using that frequently as a card to play with. If you notice, when they talk about the burden of the Syrian refugees, they never say well, Europe, the US, and regional countries should take more refugees, right? So the idea is either it's always about Syrian refugees going back to Syria. It's never about, look, we can't take it anymore. You guys need to have a more equal share of the burden, or give us more money, basically, to deal with this.
Let me just make a couple of quick comments on these points. One of the fascinating things is that almost all the people responsible for refugee issues, I'm talking about government officials across the Middle East, UN, international organizations, foreign countries, international NGOs, virtually every official person dealing with this issue has only short-term concerns. They're not, nobody is looking ahead 20 or 30 years, and nobody is looking back very far either. So this creates an opening for people like us, scholars and others, people in the end. We have people here from various donor agencies, NGO community, academic community, UN agencies. So I think a group of us somehow needs to take that, occupy that vacant space and keep raising these longer term issues. The second point related to that is we have now around 65 million people, refugees and displaced around the world. And this is growing quickly, and it's going to grow much faster with the impact of climate change, economic stagnation in many countries, regression, continued population growths that are higher than economic growths, and wars and tensions heightened now between Iran and Israel and the US, which is going to have an impact. So all the signs, and environmental, normal, other than climate change, just environmental mismanagement that leads to environmental refugees. So all the signs are that this 65 million number of world migrants and refugees is going to, and displaced people is going to grow much faster in the future. So people have to really start taking these longer term looks, and this opens up an opportunity, I think, for academics and people like us at AUB and VCARS and friends in other places can create some kind of mechanism to do this on a regular basis and not just on an occasional basis. This is something that we should look into. One other point is we had a question from somebody watching us on YouTube. Thank you for that. And the question was, are there any refugees here? The answer is, I don't think we have any Syrian refugees, but I know we have a few Palestinian refugees here, and there may be others as well. But this is not designed as a forum to directly engage with refugees, but to talk about research that we've done, which is totally based on interactions with refugees. But that's a very good question, and thank you for it. It reminds us of the importance of constantly listening to the refugees themselves, because in most cases, certainly my experience over the years as a reporter and a writer has been that if you talk to the people at the local level, whether they're refugees or just marginalized rural people or whatever, or urban poor, they know their problems better than we do, and they often can come up with better suggestions on how to fix things better than we can, or as good as we can possibly. So listening to and interacting with those people that we're studying is a critical question, and thank you for the reminder of that from the person who wrote in from watching us on YouTube. We have 2 or 3 more minutes left if there's any last comments.
I have questions sort of to Reem and Dennis and Lisa as well. So the research on public perceptions or opinion polls or towards refugees or immigrants or outsiders is very, I think, is very important. I think, even if the phenomenon is threat, even if it's not real, it's real in its consequences, at least. But what I'm interested in asking you and thinking about is that can this type of work also be coupled with actual real, not real, but like actual data on how the economy, let's say the perception that refugees are taking our jobs away, they're ruining the economy. Can this type of research also look into economic data about how, are refugees really taking jobs from the local populations, or are they generating jobs? In the case of Lebanon, for example, I can say that the arrival of Syrian refugees has generated a lot of jobs in the NGO sector. Some of our graduate students who were, it took them in the past 6 months to a year to get jobs, and now with a degree in public health, they're getting a job immediately after graduation at UNICEF, UNHCR, and many of the other local NGOs. So is there concrete data on what is happening to the economy in Lebanon and Jordan? There's a lot of data in Europe, I'm sure, but some of the data poor countries like Lebanon, Jordan.
Sure. I mean, Jordan definitely has done a great job, and in partnership with World Bank in particular, and U.S. agencies and European partners. I mean, I think Jordan's data should be trusted to the point that you can trust government facts about anything, because it also could be used in different ways. But I think these are pretty straightforward facts. As I said in my remarks, even if we see an increasing unemployment rate, again, that cannot be directly associated with Syrian refugees, because you have to couple in the other point I made about an economy grew up in a place called Zatari refugee camp that didn't exist before. That economy is real. That economy produces jobs for Syrians inside the camp as well as income for them. And it also produces income for people outside the camp because they got to supply that. So you can look at that data in many, but it has to be so multi-layered that I say, again, I'm not an economist. I don't even play one on TV. I have to step away from this question quickly. But certainly you can couple, you have to as I say, you have to layer that data in so many factors, because we do see that in many ways a rising tide lifts all boats, but a sinking ship also brings everyone down. And so that's where I think Jordan is, Lebanon is, Turkey's not in the same situation by any means.
Right. Can I make a point? When you're talking about long-term solution, I think you have to deal with refugee trauma and how you get around that. And I see it from two ways. I see the trauma that the refugees have experienced and the trauma that those who are working with them experience. And so if you're looking at a long-term solution, and AUB's done a lot of work in this, and I'm surprised actually that they're not at the table for an event like this, because it's the Harvard Center and Mass General Hospital, Harvard's political refugee work, trauma that's done it, and in the work that we're doing with Neary's Foundation is to create jobs, these micro businesses and industries within settlements or the camps, to give the women hope, because the way out of trauma is to have hope, to have a livelihood, to have a vision. And the Gata schools that have been founded, with AUB, with Shibli, Rabia Shibli's group, that study indicates that the people, the children in those schools are working in a much more pleasant environment than if they're in a tented school with leaky, cold, environment. So I would just like to leave that with you.
Thank you. We're going to have a separate briefing with Rabia for sure.
Yeah.
That's going to come up later in the fall or the winter with the colleagues he's been working at, probably from Harvard or other places. So that whole issue of youth trauma and psychological stress on youth, and also but on women and teachers and other people, we're going to give that a separate briefing, because the research that's been done, I've gone down to the Bekaa with Rabia and some of his colleagues and spent several days just watching how they work, and it's quite extraordinary. And what you find is this spirit of hope and happy memories among the kids. Some of them just 5, 6, some of them 8, 10 years old, but you see it, and you see it in the paintings they do. It's quite extraordinary. So that's going to be done on a separate briefing for sure.
Yeah, I was there a month ago and I saw it myself.
Yes, thank you. We're going to go to Beirut, to Carmen for her last comments, and then we'll close it up.
Thank you so much for including me on this panel. I just want to say on the issue of policy making, I think it cannot anymore be a question of whether this academic research should inform policy, but a question of how. And I think that is an exciting avenue to look at, both from AUB campus and from academia in the US. So thank you. Have a great day in New York. And that's all from Beirut.
Thank you, Carmen. Thank you, everybody.